All right, so we're going to get properly into it now. This is our first lecture. We're going to talk about Plato's Euthyphro, the book of Job from the Old Testament, and we're going to talk about the film A Serious Man by Joel and Ethan Coen. But before we really get into things properly, we ought to do some preliminary stuff. We ought to first talk about what we mean by God in philosophy, what we mean by the word God. What we mean is a being that is omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent. That is all-knowing, all-powerful, and perfectly good. And it's worth noting also that we mean a being that's worthy of our worship. That's often overlooked in philosophy stuff, but it's in there and it's important. So keep that in mind. Okay, so that's what we mean by God. And now we need to talk a bit about sort of definitions. Giving definitions in philosophy is a sort of a lot of what we do, which is to say we provide necessary and sufficient conditions for some things having some property or being in a member of some set of other things. So what do we mean by this? Well, a definition usually takes the form of, for any x, x is such and such, if and only if these some further conditions apply. So when we give a definition, we're giving a set of necessary and sufficient conditions for one thing's counting as another thing. So we say a condition is necessary for something if it's required to bring it about, but not enough to bring it about on its own. So for example, being a certain height is necessary for riding a roller coaster, but it's not sufficient. If it were sufficient, being 5'6" would guarantee you ride the roller coaster, but that's not true. Plenty of 5'6" people never step on or sit down on a roller coaster or any other kind of amusement park ride. Nevertheless, if they wanted to, it would have to be the case that they're above a certain height threshold. So being a certain height is necessary, but not sufficient for riding a roller coaster. In order to ride the roller coaster, you need other things, like a desire to ride the roller coaster, access to ride the roller coaster, and so on and so forth. So putting this a bit more succinctly, we say a condition is sufficient for something if it's enough to bring that thing about on its own. For example, rain is sufficient for making the streets wet. Its being rainy is enough to guarantee, well, for the most part, that the streets are wet. But it's not necessary for the streets to be wet, right? We could imagine all sorts of other scenarios in which the streets would be wet. A water truck tipped over, a water main broke, the snow melted, so on and so forth. So rain is sufficient for making the streets wet, but not necessary. Now we say something is necessary, like we said, when it's not enough to bring it about on its own, but it's required for it to count as that thing. So when we're asking about definitions, as we'll see in the Euthyphro, or you should have already seen in the Euthyphro, we're asking about the necessary and sufficient conditions for something's counting as being pious. In particular, the question is, okay, what's piety? We're saying an act is pious if and only if something obtains. So there's some set of things that together guarantee the thing is pious, and some set of things that if an act is to be pious, then it has to have these other things. It can be pious only if it has these other things. Socrates and Euthyphro together, in their sort of dialectic, which is a fancy philosophy word for back and forth, are trying to figure out what this question is. So we've talked about what we mean by God. We've talked about definitions of necessary and sufficient conditions. And the last sort of preliminary thing, and I think really the big takeaway from the piece here, is this thing called the Socratic method. So Socrates and Euthyphro are trying to figure out what piety is. Well, Socrates in particular. Euthyphro seems to think he already knows. But Socrates is trying to figure out whether the definition he's giving is good, and he does so using this certain kind of method. We call it the Socratic method, named after, you should have guessed, Socrates. Put simply, it's just the process of asking probing questions to one's conversational partner or to oneself, if one's sort of doing this internally, monologue style, and And it's meant to sort of expose and draw out inconsistencies or shortcomings in one's reasoning. So you say, well, this is the thing. And then you ask these really probing questions, right? You go, well, what about this? Well, if that means this, then doesn't that mean this? And so on and so forth, as you'll see in the piece. And we're meant to sort of be able to home in on the heart of the matter using this method. You know, Socrates appears in a bunch of all the Platonic dialogues. I think all of them? I don't know. Let's say all of them. I think it's all of them. And he's always sort of up to the same thing. Somebody says, here's the true meaning of justice. And Socrates goes, oh, you say so, do you? Well, have you thought about this? And then the person will respond in this way, and he'll go, but now I've got you. Because that leads to some contradiction or some inconsistency or some bad outcome. So that's the Socratic method, and we're going to see that on display here. And we're also going to see something like it on display in everything else we'll read, apart from the Job, because that's sort of a different kind of thing. So the Euthyphro. Now this is, I think, one of the earlier dialogues that Plato has written. It takes place between our main character, Socrates, and a person called Euthyphro. Now Euthyphro is outside of the courthouse, and he's there because he's bringing a charge against his father. Now, the charge is something like neglect, leading to someone's death. What has happened is one of their slaves has murdered some other slave. And Euthyphro has taken the murderer and treated them very harshly, and as a result, the murderer has died. And Euthyphro is prosecuting his father for neglect in the treatment of the murderer. Because on Euthyphro's view, and I think it's the right view, even though the person was a murderer, he still deserved a fair trial and fair treatment and all these sorts of things. Now, maybe Euthyphro thinks that because he thinks the murderer got off too easy. We don't really know. But that's sort of the setup of the story. So Socrates asks Euthyphro, hey man, what are you doing down here? And Euthyphro's like, I'll tell you, I'm raising charges against my father. And Socrates says, well, you must really know a lot about piety if you're doing something like that, because the gods want us to honor our fathers, and this seems like not that. So you must know a thing or two about what the gods want. And Euthyphro's like, you're gosh darn right I do. I know quite a bit. And Socrates is like, all right, man, well, let's get into it. Why don't you tell me what pious things are, what piety is? And Euthyphro's like, well, it's very simple. The pious is what's dear to the gods. And Socrates is like, okay, so if the gods like it, then it's pious. And Euthyphro's like, that's right. But then Socrates does his Socrates thing, right? He starts asking these difficult questions, right? He's like, but, the gods, there's a lot of gods, right? And they argue with each other. Euthyphro's like, yeah, they argue. He's like, but what do they argue about? They're not arguing about, matters of fact, right? They're not arguing about how tall Mount Olympus is, right? They must be arguing about something else. And Euthyphro's like, yeah, they agree on matters of fact. And he's like, so what are they arguing about? It seems like they're going to be arguing about things like right and wrong, about what's beautiful, about these sort of more difficult, less empirically verifiable questions. And Euthyphro is like, yeah, totally. That's what they argue about. And Socrates, sort of the trap is sprung. Because now Socrates can say, well, if what's pious is what's dear to the gods, but what's dear to the gods isn't unanimous, then it seems like there's going to be some things that count as both pious and impious, depending on what gods we're talking about. And that can't be, because contradictions can't be true. It can't be of one thing that it's both pious and impious, because that's a contradiction, and contradictions are no good. And Euthyphro's like, well, you got me there, but let's talk more about it. And sort of, the dialogue goes on from there. I don't think we need to spend a whole bunch of time really parsing out each of the sort of the four attempts that Euthyphro makes before. I mean, Euthyphro makes a bunch of attempts. Socrates ties him into knots a bunch of times, and then Euthyphro is essentially like, I'm sorry, buddy, I got to get on out of here. If you read more Plato, that's a pretty common theme, right? Socrates is like really giving somebody what for, and then his interlocutor, or which is a fancy word we use for conversational partner, is like, hey man, have you seen the time I have to return some videotapes? So yeah, we're going to see that repeated throughout, but there's a couple of upshots, the big picture things that I want to take away and talk about from the Euthyphro. You know, we talked earlier about definitions and about necessary and sufficient conditions. And then we saw how hard it can be to take something that we seem to know what it means, right? We seem to know what it means to be pious, right? It has something to do with pleasing the gods or pleasing God. But when we really try to drill down on what it means and get really clear about what piety consists in, it's just not obvious that we're in a position to give anything like a definition, anything like a something of the form, for any action, that action is pious if and only if such and such obtains. So that's a thing that's going to repeat itself, and I think it's a thing that's worth keeping in mind. And it's not just sort of these sort of strange value-laden concepts. Think about a word like game, right? The kind of thing you play. Now, you might have thought it's really easy to say what a game is. Such for any activity A is a game if and only if, blah, 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 blah. But as sort of a 20th century philosopher who we won't read, but is one of my favorites, Wittgenstein, has pointed out, it's actually not so simple. Anytime you try to give necessary and sufficient conditions for something like a game, or like piety, or like anything, almost, you're going to be in this situation where you wind up including things under the heading of piety or game that you should want to leave out. And you wind up failing to include things that you should want to leave in. So the way of sort of carving up the games from the non-games, or the pious from the impious, is really hard and maybe not possible. So that's one thing. One thing I want you to take away is this difficulty of giving necessary and sufficient conditions and giving definitions. The second thing we get from the Euthyphro dilemma, or the Euthyphro paper, is this thing we call the Euthyphro dilemma. Now, a dilemma in philosophy is, or in life, right? We all know what a dilemma is. It's like you can choose A or you can choose B. Both seem to be not great. So here's what we get from the Euthyphro dilemma, right? We're talking about what's pious. Now, Euthyphro says what's pious is what's dear to the gods. Socrates shows that this can't be quite right, and he also sort of lands on this other problem, right? And the question is, okay, so the pious is what's dear to the gods, but is it pious in virtue of the fact that the gods love it? Or do the gods love it because that thing is pious? So put another way, do the gods determine what's pious, or do they merely report what is pious sort of in fact from the, it's just that's how the universe is. These things are the pious ones, these are the ones you should do. Now we can move that from the Greek pantheon to talking about God like we mean it, like we talked about at the beginning of the piece, or the beginning of the lecture. We all have this kind of idea about a moral standard, about what's right and wrong, and a lot of that stuff comes from various sacred texts in which a God like the one we're talking about features heavily. Now the question is this: are the moral things moral because God says so, or does God say that they're moral because they are? Again, putting this another way, Does God determine what's right and wrong? Or does God merely report on what's right and wrong? We get a specific answer to this question in the reading on Job. Now, just a bit of background. Job is a book in the Old Testament. It's a very famous book. It's been the sort of basis for a load of short stories and films and plays because it's kind of a really interesting story. So, just a brief recap. You've got this guy Job, and Job is a really good Jew. He's a really faithful servant to God. In fact, it seems like he's God's favorite. He's got great kids, he's got a great wife, he's got a great farm, he's got yada yada yada. He's whatever you want, he's got it. Job's doing great. And he's been very blessed by God. Now at some point, the heavenly host is hanging out, it seems like. They're just having a little meeting, and the devil shows up. And God's like, hey man, where have you been? And he's like, oh, just hanging out, looking at this, checking out this Job guy. Seems like he's doing real good. And God's like, yeah, Job rocks. And essentially the devil is like, yeah, but that's only because you've treated him so good. If things were much worse for Job, I bet you he'd bounce pretty quick. He would forsake you immediately. And God's like, oh yeah? Well, let's find out. I give you carte blanche. You can do whatever you want to Job other than kill him. And I'll bet you he stays faithful. So here we have like a weird situation where God and the devil are making a bet. And again, keep in mind, are things good because God does them? Or God commands them? Or does God command or do only the good things? Keep this in mind. So God and the devil make a bet about Job, whether he'll remain faithful even through the tribulations that are about to be sort of brought to bear against him. So first, like, the devil kills his kids and all of his sheep and his oxen and his camels and so on and so forth. And Job's not taking it well. He's not being unfaithful, right? He's more confused. Like, what the hell did I do to deserve this? What's happening? And his wife is like, look, why are you still being faithful to this God character? Like, why don't you just curse God and then die? That's what he deserves. This sucks. God sucks, essentially. And Job's like, nah, God is the best. He's going to see me through this, even through all the tribulations. And there's another meeting with the heavenly host, and God's like, hey, did you see Job still hanging in there? And the devil's like, yeah, but that's only because I only took his stuff away. Stuff's just stuff. I'll bet you if I took away his health, things would go a bit different. And God's like, all right, do whatever you want, just don't kill him. And the devil's like, cool. And then he gives Job like leprosy, which is a disease where your skin falls off. He makes his hair fall out. He makes it really not great. And Job still hangs in there. He's still like, man, what did I do? What am I doing wrong? How do I fix this? He never at any point is like, what the hell, God? This isn't cool. He's like, gotta be me. But I don't know what I did. And then he has loads of friends come around and say, well, it must be you. Clearly, you're the asshole here. It's gotta be you. It couldn't be God. It's gotta be you. And Job's like, I know, but what did I do? And it goes on like this for many, many pages. And at one point, Job says, like, look, man, if I'm sinning, what am I doing? What am I doing wrong? And then later, God shows up and he's like, how dare you question me? I'm God. Yada, yada, yada. And then Job's like, yeah, fair enough. You are God. I'm just a lowly little critter. And who am I to question you? But he remains faithful throughout. And then God restores Job all the things that he lost, which I've always found quite a bit absurd. I think if you ask any parent, like, hey, if your first couple of kids died, but then you got new kids who were better, like, that'd be cool, right? I feel like most parents would be like, nah, dog, that would not be cool. So it's a weird thing And I think when we ask ourselves this sort of Euthyphro dilemma kind of question, is it good because God says so? Or does God say so because it's good? First off, Job seems to take a clear side on the first thing. Whatever God does, that's what's good. But I think we, sitting back here, can look at the stuff God's doing here, or the stuff God's allowing to be done, and go, that's not great at all. This seems crazy. And again, like, the worry with it's all good when God does it, like, whatever God does, that's what's good. The worry is that God could behave like he behaves in Job, right? He could be callous and capricious and cruel. And that, we see that a lot in the Old Testament. It's worth, the Old Testament, whether you're religious or not, excuse me, is worth having a look at in some parts. It's a pretty interesting window into sort of ancient times and all that sort of thing. So we have this dilemma, and then we have Job, right? And Job gives a clear response to he thinks, to how the author of Job, whoever that might have been, thinks the dilemma ought to be resolved. They didn't have this in mind, probably. We're just putting these two together. It's not as though the book of Job is a response to Socrates, because presumably the book of Job was written way before Euthyphro. Yes, almost certainly. But we can put them together and think about it. So Job gives an answer. Whatever God does, those are the good things, right? And how dare you question God? But we can see just from our vantage point that seems really crazy, because God could turn out to be a jerk. God could act in really lousy ways, and those ways would just be good because God did them, and that seems wrong. Okay, so now we should say a bit about the movie. So the movie takes place in the 1960s in Minnesota. Features a Jewish family led by Larry Gopnik, who's a physics instructor at a local college. And he pretty much just goes through a Job thing, right? A modern day Job, as it were. He finds out his wife's leaving him. His kids are terrible. Like, his son isn't taking his Torah study seriously for his bar mitzvah. He's more concerned with, like, smoking weed and listening to psychedelic rock from the 60s. His daughter seems always to be washing her hair. So his kids aren't great. Oh, and his son is, like, really concerned about, like, hey, why doesn't the TV work? Can you go on the roof and fix the TV? And he's just, like, pretty put upon, right? He's a pretty passive kind of guy in a way that Job seems not to be. He's not super faithful in the way that Job is, but he's going through these, like, Job-like encounters. So it's just really a way of sort of visualizing what the Job story consists in a more concrete way. I think it's a really good movie. I liked it much more this past time that I watched it a few weeks ago than I did when I first saw it. So I hope that you enjoy it too. So here's my here's one hypothesis about the film that I have. And I wonder what you think of this. This is not strictly philosophical, but it's just a filmic kind of thing. So we had that opening scene, right, when they're in the shtel, and the guy comes home, and he tells his wife, like, oh, I saw the rabbi, and he helped me with my wheel on my cart. And his wife's like, this rabbi? And he's like, yeah, that rabbi. And she's like, well, that guy died like a year ago. So you saw a ghost. And the husband is like, get out of here. Couldn't have been a ghost. He helped me. I invited him over for soup. So the guy comes over for soup. Doesn't eat any soup. Maybe a little evidence that he's a dybbuk. That's a malevolent spirit that inhabits a dead person, I guess. And so they go on and they sort of fight about it. Then he shows up, and then she stabs him, and then he wanders out in the snow and dies. Now, we don't know whether that guy is a dybbuk or not. But here I want to bring us back to the only person in the book of Job who's willing to say, like, God sucks. Just curse him and get it over with and then die. And Job is like, you're dumb because you're a woman, because, it was it was an acceptable thing to say at the time. Still wrong, but, that's how they talked back then, it seems. But I think what the initial scene of the film is trying to say is that maybe Job's wife was right. Right? We have like a guy who says a thing in both instances, a wife who says something that seems to be talking some sense to some degree or other. The response being like, get out of here, you don't know what you're talking about, quiet down. And then in the Job, that's all we get. But it seems like, we get this same kind of parallel story in A Serious Man. And maybe this is Joel and Ethan Coen saying, like, look, she's right. Job's wife was right. Just the same way this guy's wife is right. I'm not sure, but I think that would be the most parsimonious explanation for why that scene is in the film. And again, so one big takeaway from the movie, I think, is that Larry is just like a really passive guy, He's not doing anything. Life just sort of happens, and he goes along with it. Move to the Jolly Roger, fix the antenna, meet with Stu, deal with his brother. The only initiative he takes is to ask like sort of various rabbis why things are happening to him. And none of the rabbis say the obvious thing, right? The first rabbi is like, look how awesome this parking lot is. God is everywhere. And then the second rabbi is like, here's a story about the goy's teeth. And the third rabbi won't even see him, and he's just like, cool, fair enough. I guess I'll go. He doesn't take any control. So no one says to him what they should say. These things are happening on some level because you're letting them happen. Take some control. But he doesn't. And presumably because he's terrified of taking any kind of control at all. He kind of takes control in his dreams. And those quickly become nightmares. Now, there's a few moments in the film where he's having a clear dream and it goes real bad real quick. So in the end, the whirlwind that Larry Gopnik reaps is one that's at least partially of his own making. And keep this in your mind, because when we start talking about meaning of life stuff in a couple of modules, this will be relevant. We won't talk about it, but it's something that's worth keeping in your mind. So, what have we done? We talked about some preliminary stuff, what we mean by God. We talked about what we mean by necessary and sufficient conditions and what definitions are in philosophy in general. We talked about the Socratic method, what that consists in. We then talked a bit about the Euthyphro, gave a bit of a summary and gave some upshots of what we get out of the Euthyphro. Then we talked about the Book of Job, again, bit of a summary and some upshots. And then finally, we talked about some big themes in the movie. I gave you sort of my harebrained hypothesis about the opening sort of vignette in the Coen film and the bit of Job with his wife. And then that takes us to the end. So thank you for watching. Next time, we will talk about this paper by J.L. Mackie called Evil and Omnipotence, and we will watch the film The Seventh Seal by Ingmar Bergman from 1957. So I'll look forward to chatting with you about those next time.